Whew. Thank you, Kyle. Such genuine and beautiful songwriting and lovely. And the right kind of songs really for today's musings, and because one of the things that I asked all of you to do was to help me with the idea of the great questions. That's the series we're in. Well, what do you think they are? What are the great questions? What comes up? And 3 separate people suggested we talk about what is an elder. And so I thought, okay, those are good odds. Might as well go with that one. I think it's a question worth contemplating, and in a way, it's a question that was threaded in the last couple of songs we heard, and in today's meditation. And well, let me just begin by just reading some T.S. Eliot. I'm not going to really talk much about this poem or part of a poem. I only included a couple little excerpts here. But I thought we'd at least hear some poetry just to sort of set the stage. So what we call the beginning is often the end. What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. I mean, I think he's speaking about some deep mysteries. And I think he's speaking about the deep mysteries embedded in aging. And I think he's speaking about the mysteries of when something ends and when something begins. And one of the lines I'm drawn to, we shall not cease from exploration, which is a funny way of it's a funny phrase in a musing about the ending of things. Because he's, I guess pointing to a kind of paradox here. We shall not cease from exploration. And I want you to carry that line as we sort of ponder the question at hand, which is, what is an elder, and do we even need them? Or maybe we should just release them all to the golf course and call it good. So we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. So, by the way, this is one of about 5 or 6 little paragraphs, and I think this is in... No, that's Rilke, Letters to a Young. This is T.S. Eliot. Anyway, I'm not going to remember where it's from right this second. Maybe it'll come back to me soon. Yeah, it might be the 4 quartets, yeah. New Giddings or Little Giddings or something, some section of the 4 quartets. So, okay. So some good songs and some poetry to sort of set the stage. Now I'm going to give you a job. And the introverts might revolt, but they'll do it quietly, so it won't be that big of a deal. And I'm going to invite you to just turn just to the people around you. And I want you to wrestle with a couple of questions. I want you to talk about this before I talk about it. Because I'm not an elder, and at least by my definition, and or working definition. And so I want to hand it over to you a little bit. And so here are a couple of options for questions. I just want you to just talk amongst yourselves. So something like, what is an elder? And if you do so, maybe focus on qualities. Well, what qualities does an elder seem to embody or inhabit? Which is another way of saying, what is an elder? And then try to gather them up in your little group and sort of talk about them, just chit-chat. It doesn't have to be long. I'd say 40 minutes. I'll see you next time. No, just try to gather up some qualities here, and then use those qualities as a way of listening to what I might have to say. Like, so where's the overlap? What's missing? What's not? A couple of other questions. If what is an elder, the qualities of an elder is too challenging, maybe start with what is an elder not? Sometimes it's a nice place to start. Well, definitely it's not so-and-so, you know. And here are maybe some questions that might come up, like, why do we need them? And one final one you might want to just throw in the cauldron here is, do you know any? Do you know any? And if you happen to be sitting with one, you might not want to say that person right there, because then it might feel a little awkward, but do you know any? And that might even help you with the question of quality. So I know some of you are probably sitting by people you know, some of you might be sitting by people you don't, so you can do a quick introduction, but nothing too fancy here, no bios, no resumes, okay, nothing like that. So this is a little 5-minute exercise for you to chat amongst yourselves, and I'll see you in a few. Okay. All right, I want to invite you to finish your thoughts here and then turn your seats. Okay. Well, I mean, we should do this more often. It seems to be more interesting than me just standing up here talking. And it's nice to see these conversations sort of just emerging. And so hang on to these little qualities. And as I'm speaking, just sort of say, does that resonate with what Kent's talking about? What am I missing? What did you hear? And I'll ask you some questions at the very end. So, okay. So the very first thing I thought of when I got a few emails, what is an elder? I thought about this book that has been so influential in my life. This is a book by Bill Plotkin. It's called Nature and the Human Soul. It's Bill Plotkin is also one of my sort of guides and teachers. He started Animas Valley Institute, where I've been doing my guide training work for the last 6 years, which I leave today, by the way, for Colorado for another apprenticeship. So that'll be fun. Anyway, I thought about this book because he has something in here called the Soul-Centric Developmental Wheel, which sounds quite fancy. And it's his version of sort of an 8-stage approach to psycho-spiritual development or growth. And it's a model. It's not so much a theory. It's an operating model. And as other people like Erik Erikson and many others have models, and they're sort of all talking to one another as well. But I'm mentioning that because it's assuming something like, the book is assuming something like, there are passages and stages of life that we go through. And you can have a sort of arrested development, or you can be stuck somewhere, or you can have unfinished business in previous stages. This is usually what most of the models agree on. And it also assumes something like this. and I'll just say it as bluntly as I can right now, just because you're old doesn't make you an elder, in that sense. However, we could also say the other way around, that there's kind of a necessity of age when it comes to a quality of an elder. So it seems to work that way as well. So I'm not going to give you all 8 stages of the soul-centric developmental wheel. That would take me a while. But I wanted to, some of what I have to say today is I'm pulling up from this book, which is a pretty interesting read. You can try it sometime yourself if you want. But Bill Plotkin uses 2 images for end-of-life stages. So he talks about sort of elderhood as having two expressions or 2 stages. I'm just going to talk about one of them really today, but I'm going to give you the images. So one image he calls Master in the Grove of Elders. That's the image. Master in the Grove of Elders. And the final 8th stage, that's stage 7, final 8th stage is Sage in the Mountain Cave. Okay, I'm not going to say much about that. That's probably a little closer to the sort of thing that T.S. Eliot is probing around with his paradoxes about beginnings and endings and our exploring and things like that. So a lot of what I'm going to say in the next couple minutes just comes from this Grove of Elders section. Now, when Plotkin wrote this book, he says, I think even in the book, I don't consider myself to be an elder, so I better talk to some. So what's interesting about the book is that it contains pretty extensive interviews with 2 people, Joanna Macy and Thomas Berry. So you might know some of their work. Joanna Macy is probably more well-known than Thomas Berry is, but they're both sort of earth elders kind of in their own right and have had long careers of intellectual pursuits, activism pursuits, all kinds of very interesting lives. So some of what's in here is from an interview. I'm going to read you bits and pieces. So, okay, I have 5 points I want to try to make, but this is kind of by way of introduction. Let's say something very simple, that being an elder is the ending of adulthood. Like, that probably didn't come up in your circles. What is an elder? Well, it's the end of adulthood. Because you have to draw some lines here. Now, I understand we're using images and words, and they have limits, but let's allow them to have some boundaries. There are certain things about adulthood that are relinquished, or we could wonder are relinquished in a phase or a stage of elderhood. Your concerns are different, you could say. And you find yourself in that place. It's not like you have a certain birthday and you're like, I'm done being an adult, thank you very much. And also you have added complexities of what do we mean by adulthood and what's an adult, and that's much of what's in this book, what makes a healthy adult and what doesn't. Bill Plotkin also says starkly most people are stuck in adolescence psychologically. So there's that sort of, dark cloud over a lot of this. So a simple way of saying it is we don't have that many elders to begin with. But there is a sort of letting go of a certain adulthood concerns. Sorry about that. And you might even say, another way of putting it is a kind of waning of accomplishments. A kind of waning of accomplishments that you consent to and live into. An elder might be drawn to this sort of thing. And I might put it another way, these are my words, kind of one's social or economic status no longer matters in the way it does to a, quote, adult. Your social, economic status, even you could say your role starts to get a little cloudy. And one of the things I think Plotkin names in here is that this is also a crisis. To move from one stage to the next is a crisis of sorts. I mean, you remember the moving from childhood to adolescence? Downright scary, terrible, fiery crisis. All of these passages have that dimension. So this is something you would want to consider. Well, what is that like, and what is the nature of this crisis? And have I ever felt the kind of disorientation that happens moving into a certain life passage? Okay, so here are my 5 points. Point number 1, here's a quality that I think elders seem to have, that there is a transition, and the transition is from a mode of doing to a mode of being. It's probably the simplest way of putting it. A mode of doing and a mode of being. This is actually, I'm going to pick on like pop psychology, spiritual-ish advice right now. A lot of young people, are listening to podcasts and practicing meditation and just trying to be all about being. But there's something sort of like, there's a kind of tension at work here. I'm not against being present and all about being and so forth, but there's a certain mode of life, which we call adulthood, that is a lot of doing. You can be all about, I'm just about being in the present moment, just about showing up and being who I am, and then you're like, oh, shit, got to change a diaper right now, okay? That's just part of it. And also, even normal things like career and wanting to invest in the world in a certain way and develop your gifts and all these kinds of things. But the marker here, one marker I'm suggesting, is a kind of, starts to dawn on one, or you might recognize it in someone else. That's probably a better way of recognizing it. It's a kind of transition from doing to being. They're no longer about like, if I could just do fill in the blank, or if I could just make it to the top, or if I could just run for president now at a certain age, then I would, that's the mode of doing. And there's something I think important about the mode of being, which is like a kind of return to childhood. Why do you think grandparents and grandkids get along so well? It's largely because it's about being, honestly. And you wouldn't want to be around a grandparent who was with a very tiny child and said, now what are you going to do in life? It just wouldn't make any sense. It would just be awkward and, this kind of thing. So I'm going to read you some Joanna Macy because she puts this quite beautifully in this interview. So listen to her words here. For me, moving into elderhood has been a movement from informing or arguing or persuading or telling to evoking. Do you feel the difference? She's not saying there's anything wrong with any of those things. That's called being a healthy adult. Like, you need some persuading and arguing and telling. To evoking, she says. From informing to invoking. From arguing to blessing. From proving, I don't have the slightest interest in proving anything anymore, she says. And not so much in telling either. To hinting, waiting, blessing, or evoking. And I have greater gratitude and greater comfort in not knowing. This is the don't know mind, which is recognized more in Buddhism than any of the other major religions. You know what's interesting? She's saying she's recognizing this in the stage of being an elder, and she's also describing what qualities an elder might possess. So that kind of just evoking by presence, you could say. So not lecturing. And you heard that meditation, how much gratitude was sprinkled in the meditation? That's what she's saying. There's a certain gratitude for just being, and then just being evokes more gratitude. And you don't have to prove it. It's not like, let's create 7 arguments for why gratitude will give you the life you want, and you can accomplish more. It's that kind of like telling. There's a kind of letting go that happens. Am I making sense so far? Okay. Point number 2. And this is playing on the image of the grove. Okay? The grove. So first, let's just notice some things about the natural world, that a mature forest has mature trees in it. And those grove of trees, or elder trees, we could call them, sustain and feed the forest. They hold the soil together, they communicate. I don't need to get into the whole business of trees at the moment. They also, by the way, we used to think that tree life was just a race to the top, and it's a, fight or flight kind of, like the trees are like, to their neighbor trees, F you, I'm going. But it turns out to be quite the opposite, that elder trees will give away nutrients to younger trees. That's amazing. Now, we shouldn't even be surprised, because we're part of nature, and And a healthy parent, that's the way they're going to parent, you know? They're not going to say, I'm going to get all I can, good luck if there are any leftovers, kids. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And so we would expect to find elements like this just in the natural world. So anyway, hold on to the image of a grove and ponder this. So what would we expect to find in an elder? Well, that they would meet together from time to time, and there'd be a kind of community, and their presence would nurture the surrounding environment. So one thing you could say, when you're around an elder, is when they're nurturing the environment in which they're occupying, like by their life, by their presence. There's a kind of nurturing that's happening. It doesn't have to come through teaching, but more along the lines of evoking, you could say. Okay, here's point number 3. That there's a move. This is more technical language inside the book, so we won't get into all this stuff, but one way of describing part of the journey here is the move from this is adulthood, from being an apprentice to an artisan to a master. And master is more in the realm of elderhood here. And so here are some descriptions. So a master is less interested in innovation, but in caring for the larger web. This becomes a sort of primary focus. Not just like inventing or even creating or doing something new or making a contribution, but the concern starts to move toward the larger web. And what does that mean? I mean the larger web of life. I mean the larger web of a family. I mean the larger web of a community. I mean the larger web of the cosmos, if you want to pull it out that far. That an elder has this kind of consciousness that starts to dawn on them. And they start to embody this kind of feeding of the larger web, you could say. Here's a line. Wisdom is to understand the balance between the human and the larger web. We can't expect that in a way of an adolescent. It's not like they can understand it conceptually. But in terms of evoking that and embodying that and being that, in living into the kind of balance, and that being a primary concern, it's just can't be until you're a certain age, is what's being sort of hinted at here, suggested. Another element of this sort of thing is a word like mentor. I'm just curious, how many in your little circles, little chat groups, did something like mentor come up? Anybody have something like that? Maybe a few of you. Yeah, mentor. What do we mean by such a thing? We mean someone standing behind a lectern telling people what to do. That's a mentor. No, we know that. There's a kind of archetype with mentor. It actually comes from the Odyssey. So maybe I should tell you that just very briefly, I suppose. So the Odyssey begins, kind of like T.S. Eliot's poem, with the next generation and not with Odysseus. That should tell you something about the general concern of someone who's writing from that elder place. So we think, it's all about Odysseus' journey. Well, it starts off with Telemachus, his son. Telemachus is bitter. He's at home. All these suitors are courting his mom. He's annoyed, and he wants to get rid of them, but he doesn't have enough courage to kill all the suitors, and he doesn't really know what to do. So he's basically whining in his room. And eventually he's down on the beach, sort of in turmoil, and a man named Mentor comes up to him. That's where we get the word. And Mentor comes in the spirit of Athena. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and speaks to him. And essentially this is what he says. Kent Dobson's paraphrase. Quit whining. It's time to leave the island. Because if you don't really discover if your father is dead or alive, you're never going to become a fully human person here, and you're never going to take your place as king. So leave this place. And if your father's dead, then bury him and move on. But if he's not dead, okay, then you got to work something out here. So, and then Mentor says, I'll go with you for a little while. And that's it. So now think about that as a kind of archetypal role. There's a sort of, Mentor comes in from the side, not a family member. Mentor is old. And there is a little bit of harshness, like, quit doing what you're doing. But then there's like a tiny invitation that I'll go with you. He doesn't say, I'll tell you what to do. He just said, I'll go with you for a little while. And that's probably the sort of the deepest thread of how we ordinarily think about mentors. They walk alongside for a little while. And this is something that uniquely an elder can inhabit in a society, in a culture, in a way that an adult cannot. And certainly not an adolescent. Am I making sense so far? Okay. Two other things. Oh, okay, I'll give you some, here's a little, I don't know if this has so much to do with mentor, but it has to do with this kind of mastery here and community of elders. Here, this is from a rabbi, Zalman Schachter Salomoni. How's that for a Jewish name? He's a founder of this thing called the Spiritual Eldering Institute. Okay, this is what he says. I'm thinking of an elder corps, like CORPS. Thinking of an elder corps. Instead of sending young soldiers into the world's troubled spots, we should send elders. Do you feel how already, who thinks like that? Well, someone who's concerned about the larger web of life, someone who's interested in mentoring, okay? They would meet with those who had lost grandchildren on both sides of the conflict and grieve with them. Do you feel how that's about presence? It's not even about conflict resolution, like, okay, you tell me your side, we'll sort of do the math. I think that with such conversations, the aggravated political climate of the world would yield to wisdom and compassion. Okay, I'll stop there. There's more to that quote, but I'll just leave it at that. It's so beautiful. Now, who thinks like that? I'm saying people who are at a certain stage, who are embodying certain qualities, are able to concern themselves with the larger web of life. Probably what we ought to have in the United States is a council of elders and then the rest of the government, Because we can certainly say the government that's doing the work, so to speak, doesn't seem to be operating like a council of elders. They're not going to suggest something like this. Why not? Because they're still concerned with competition and where am I and who's on top and doing and innovating and change and we've got to make something happen, and they don't have that consciousness yet. Have I made sense? All right. Two more pieces, and then I'm done. So here's another sort of component that I think is true of a quality of elder. You can see how there are threads weaving here, weaving these things together, but there's a concern in general for wholeness. That not only in this, that everything on earth is allowed its true place. That's a kind of wholeness. Wholeness is not the same thing as perfection, but there's a kind of enveloping consciousness that honors the whole. And I would say, at least in my opinion, an elder embodies a certain amount of personal and psychosocial, spiritual wholeness themselves. They're not just always going around acting like wounded junior hires on the playground, okay? Which, this can happen. I don't know if you know any none of you though, I don't know if you know old people that still act like they're wounded junior hires on the playground, okay? There hasn't been a lot of personal cultivation of wholeness, so there does seem to be some necessity here. So my main point right now is that wholeness is a concern, and they have the capacity to tend to such things in the broader community. Tend to wholeness. Like if you're upset about the water quality of a particular stream in a particular spot in your neck of the woods, tending to that is not just tending to that particular thing, but to the wholeness of the community itself. That's where the consciousness that feeds that sort of action comes from. Okay, and the final thing I want to say has to do with consciousness, so we'll read some Einstein here. And it's not the one I'm always saying, like, what's the one I'm always saying? No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that creates it. He said other things, apparently. Okay, so here's a line from Einstein. A human being is part of a whole called by us the universe. A part limited in time and space, We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest. A kind of optical delusion of consciousness. The delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. This is a fancy way of saying moving from a more egocentric consciousness to a cosmos-centric consciousness. This is a fancy way of describing what Rilke meant by I live my life in widening circles that move out across the world. That's what growth looks like, and that's how you can recognize an elder. Do they have a consciousness that is widening here? And would you say that that's the way we treat older people in our culture? We expect their consciousness to be widening? Do you expect that? We almost expect the opposite. They're just going to become more and more narrow and more stuck and more small and more egocentric. That doesn't feel right, does it? No. And a culture without elders growing in this kind of expanded consciousness is a dangerous place to be, we could say. So just hear these words again. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. So, in a way, it's a kind of death of the ego. I mean, you could say that's all spiritual growth is lots of little mini deaths. And it's a kind of death to our, I'm not even using ego in a bad sense, but sort of egocentric posture. My views, my ideas, my rights, my 401k, my life, even my kids here, my grandkids. That's it, he's saying. That becomes a prison. And an elder is the kind of person that those walls dissipate and there's some expansion. There's an expansion of consciousness here. And maybe it starts with things dawning on you like, I guess I'm not going to live forever. And what is still at work here? What's working through me? What kind of mystery is still at work? And how might, by my sheer presence or the presence of those in my community who are elders, have a kind of generative effect on the world? Something like that. So we might even call it a deepening of partnership with the larger forces of life. This is how I think about eldership. A deepening of a partnership with the larger forces of life, rather than me against the world. You know? I did it my way is the egocentric mantra of smallness. And I mean, whatever. Who is that? Frank Sinatra or something? Okay, whatever. I mean, I'm not really picking on him. He's also expressing something cultural, but it is small. You know. Thomas Berry, by the way, I'm not going to get into him right now because I don't have time, but Thomas Berry calls this an understanding of the dream of the earth. That the elder begins to hear the dream of the earth and to harmonize with it and to expand in that way. And I guess my point today is that I think it's important to speak about the value of growing up like this. And I think it's important to speak about the value of having elders. I think it's important to speak about the value of the elders that you have in your own life. And if you feel like you're not much of an elder, go hang out with one. Be affected by their presence, because I'm telling you something. It seems like the general trajectory of what we would call dominant mainstream culture does not have these values. and in a way doesn't want to be influenced by elders, wants to stick to sort of whatever the dominant mainstream concerns are. And the elders are the kind of people that just by sheer presence cast a different kind of aim or trajectory on meaning, on purpose, on direction, on aim, on growth, on nurturing, on including more and more into the realm of what's important. And we desperately need communities of elders. We need individual elders, but we need communities of elders. We need groves. That's why the image that he uses is a master in the grove of elders. It's not meant to be done alone. There's a kind of nurturance of wisdom that takes place, and I think we live in a sort of sick society that needs that now more than ever. So, okay, that's it for me. I'll end with some Rilke, just for fun. All right, I live my life in widening circles that move out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, around the primordial tower. I've been circling for 1,000 years, and I still don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? Thanks for listening.